I'd like to take a moment to welcome you today, Stephen, to be with us here on this program. I understand that we do have some common basis in this type of work. I was on the Truth Project for Del Tackett and Focus on the Family.
Yeah, very good.
And I understand you were very important to the True You Project that was produced by the same people. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I was, before I went full-time with Discovery Institute 7 years ago, I was a college professor for 12 years and found that I had a lot of college students that were in that period of life when they were trying to decide what they really believed about fundamental issues. They were involved in, a lot of soul searching and deliberation. And I used to get the English majors and the philosophy majors who couldn't sleep at night coming to my office to talk about the big questions. And one of them was a football player who was I had misjudged as a big dumb jock, and he was in fact probably one of the top 2 or 3 students I ever had. And I was at a religious college, a Presbyterian school, and he had not come for the Christian mission of the school. He'd come to chase girls and play football.
Right.
But he was encountering young women who had a sincere Christian faith who weren't interested in dating him because they had a different worldview, and he began to probe and ask, well, why do you believe in Christianity? And he got frustrated because so many times he'd get the answer, to hard questions, he'd get the answer, I don't know, you just have to have faith. So he came to my office one day, and I wouldn't say he knocked on the door, he banged on the door, and I thought, this only can be one guy, and I got up, and sure enough, it was my big football player friend, and he was very frustrated because he'd had a conversation about the historical reliability of the Bible or the problem of evil or something, and he wasn't getting satisfactory answers. And he said, why can't someone around here give you some reasons for faith? And his hands were kind of approaching uncomfortably my neck, and I thought, so out of self-defense as much as anything else, I said, well, why don't we do a course on that? And I'll never forget the look on his face, because he just stopped dead in his tracks, and he said, you mean you think there are some? And I said, well, of course I do, or else I wouldn't be a Christian. And he said, I'd be very interested in something about that. And so we devised a course. I had a lot of faculty colleagues who were, half a generation ahead of me. They'd come of age in the 60s. They were pretty much all Kierkegaardian and into the blind leap of faith. And I got some ribbing when I put up posters for this class from older faculty, but it seemed to scratch where the students were itching. I had a great turnout for the very first class, not because I had offered anything great, but just because it was a topic. Students wanted to know if there were reasons for faith. Anyway, long story short, that was my signature course at Whitworth, where I taught for 12 years, and then at some other schools. And when Focus on the Family was looking to do something for high school and college kids, they approached me about doing that course on camera as what Del Tackett called the prequel to the Truth Project, because the Truth Project does a fabulous job of explaining what a Christian worldview means for all these different spheres of life. If you have a Christian worldview, how does that play out in marriage and family? How does it play out in business and science and government? But it left unanswered the question, why should you adopt a Christian worldview in the first place? Which is what my course attempted to do. It actually makes a cumulative case for biblical Christianity. And so it's a kind of a complement to what Del has so ably done for adults. Yes. It really targeted towards the last year in high school and the first few years in college, when so many students of faith are encountering that hostility from the secular professorate.
I've often said that we live in the most anti-intellectual period in Christian history. Not anti-scientific, but anti-mind, anti-rationality. And it's become pervasive throughout the church, this whole idea of you have to take your Christianity by faith, take a leap in the dark and hope somebody's out there to catch you. It is Kierkegaardian to an extreme. Yeah. And yet Christianity is profoundly rational from beginning to end. It addresses the mind. There can be no affection in the heart that doesn't first come through the mind.
This was the motto I used to have on my office door, and then I'd used it in the Reasons for Faith class. I may have heard this from someone else, but I used to tell my students, the heart cannot exult in what the mind rejects. And I found so many times with students who were losing their faith, very oftentimes at Christian colleges, this happens and was happening. It was because they were encountering intellectual objections to the faith that started to erode their subjective passion for Christ or for the Bible. And it happens very often at seminaries. And we used to, we had a very a strong religion and philosophy department where I was at Whitworth of mainly believing, in fact, entirely believing professors who used to agonize over where to send their students to seminary because they realized that they'd often go to seminary and encounter these for lack of a better term, the higher critical deconstruction of the text, of the biblical text. Now, there's more sophisticated, more avant-garde ways of doing the deconstruction than just the 19th century higher criticism. But you know what I mean. The attempt to undermine the students' confidence is in the basic historical reliability of the biblical witness. So,
but isn't it wonderful that this football student could see through all of that and come to you and ask you?
Interesting. Yeah.
Augustine said, that there's a difference between faith and credulity. And faith that is irrational is simple credulity, and that honors no one.
I think that's right. And what we've come to rely on as faith, or what we've come to associate with faith in our contemporary culture, is really a feeling. And I've had the sense that the ultimate issue in our time is what my colleague in the ID movement, Philip Johnson, he puts it this way, he said, the ultimate issue is God real or imaginary? There are plenty of people who are willing to concede an imaginary God or a God as concept that gives you subjective comfort, but that comfort is cold and not very lasting in the face of all the things that buffet us in life if there isn't some conviction that's also based on truth.
Well, this crosses the street to the other disciplines as well. When I was teaching philosophy in the university, I had a senior elective course, and on one occasion, the question of macroevolution came up. And I just asked the students, there were some 30 students in the class, how many of you believe in macroevolution? And 29 hands went up. And I said, well, I'm not here today to debate that particular issue. We were studying epistemology at the time, and I said, what I'd like to know is what arguments have persuaded you of this position? And I went to the blackboard, and I took up a piece of chalk, and I wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to list the 5 most compelling arguments that had persuaded them of this position. I had one student who later became a postdoc student in the study of the brain who said, common substance means common source, and I wrote that on the board. And I said, what else? And for all my endeavors, I couldn't pry another reason out of them except the one they kept saying, this is what I've always been taught.
All reasonable people agree.
Yes, that's exactly. But they couldn't reproduce an argument. Case. Yeah.
And yet, what's so striking about the origin of species is that Darwin self-consciously is prosecuting an argument. He calls the book One Long Argument for the idea of universal common descent being produced by his mechanism of natural selection. That's the descent with modification. So he's very much stands in the tradition of the rhetoric of science. He's as did Newton. He's making an argument for a radical new way of looking at life, and yet most people who have accepted the conclusion of that argument can't reproduce even the most basic of the arguments for the proposition. And what that shows is the power of essentially a form of indoctrination that takes place where students are told the conclusion without the supporting documentation. Exactly. And science has moved on a bit since 1859. There's some reasons to question that theory. I admire Darwin and the way he put together his case, but we've learned a lot since his time, and
But usually it takes an abundance of anomalies before a hypothesis is surrendered.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But the abundance of anomalies has accumulated. And
I know.
Of course, Darwin knew nothing in the 1850s about genetics. When Mendel came along just a little later, his theory had to be revised in light of that. But since the revolution of Watson and Crick and the molecular biological revolution that ensued, there's a lot of new data to take into account in looking at life's origins.
You were involved in the movie project with Ben Stein, Expelled.
Right.
The issue of intelligent design, and we have this enormous prejudice out there against any consideration of ID, as we said. What do you think motivates that negative response?
Well, partly what you just said. When people are uncomfortable with their own intellectual position, or when they don't fully understand the basis of it, there's a kind of insecurity that ensues. It's one of the things that attracted Ben Stein to the project when he learned about the case of Richard Sternberg at the Smithsonian Institution and how he'd been treated. He in the super trailer to the film, he said, in my experience, this is not the way people who are confident in their intellectual position act. And when he saw these cases of suppression, of retribution being enacted against very competent scientists, that to him, as a non-scientist but as a very shrewd guy, was an indicator that the people defending the Darwinian orthodoxy were actually insecure about their position. You don't resort to power if you can instead provide a compelling counter-argument. And so I think that's part of it. There's this sociological dimension, this sense that all reasonable people agree, and we're not sure why, but all reasonable people agree. Therefore, if you dissent, you're not reasonable by definition, and you have to be suppressed.
There's also an antipathy and hostility there towards Christianity, and a fear that ID will introduce.
People don't like where it's leading. Is
that's right.
The way
they don't want that. Yeah. But there's also, what I have seen is a fundamental fear of the intrusion of philosophy into the scientific realm. And when I look at this as a philosopher, I have to smile a little bit, because the scientific community is it's pervaded with naturalism. Well, there's naturalism is a philosophy.
Exactly. The Darwinian establishment's doing philosophy, and in a very bad way. The way it works. First, comment about, back to just revisiting your first question about what's driving this. I have a friendly debating partner, Michael Ruse, who's a committed Darwinist, but a genuine good guy, and very congenial. And Michael and I have squared off a number of times, but he's written a very important book in which he explains that Darwinism has functioned for many scientists as a kind of secular religion. Right. And the commitment that is manifested in some of these expelled-like cases is a kind of almost fanatical zeal. And I think it's typical of what happens to people. It's the human condition. When you have fundamentally, or when you have deeply held personal beliefs that are challenged by evidence that you don't know how to respond to, very often, if any person's in that situation, they respond emotionally, sometimes somewhat irrationally, sometimes by resorting to power rather than persuasion.
Yes.
And so that's human nature, and I think that's part of what's driving the extreme hostility that we find now in the Darwinian community, as it's directed to people against people like Richard Sternberg or Guillermo Gonzalez or any number of the others whose cases were documented in the film Expelled.
Well, Stephen, you've dropped a bombshell on the playground of the scientists with your book and the signature in the cell, which speaks of the relationship of, I guess, molecular biology with intelligent design. Can you tell us a little bit about the central thesis of that?
Yeah, sure. I wrote the book in 2007 and got it out in 2009. But I'd been stewing on it for a long time. The idea for it is kind of embarrassing, but my son was a year old, and I finished it when he was 18 as a senior in high school. But I got interested in the mid-'80s in what I call in the book the DNA Enigma, the mystery of the origin of the information that's necessary to build life. And I became interested in this because I attended a conference in the mid-'80s that had a huge seminar in the middle of it on the origin of life problem with some world-class people in the field. And I had a double major in science as an undergraduate. I was working as a geophysicist, and I was under the impression that the evolutionary biologists had this question all sewn up. And I was shocked to realize that some of the top people in the field, I mean almost all, acknowledged that the field of origin of life research is what it's called, was the field was in a state of complete impasse. And that the fundamental question that was tripping up the scientists trying to account for the origin of life was the origin of the information that's encoded in DNA. It's one thing to do these experiments and build these chemicals, get them to arise through undirected chemical interactions. It's quite another to get the chemical constituents of the key molecules in life, like the DNA and the proteins and the RNA, to line up in the right way, to become sequenced or arranged to store information. And what we now know about life is that information runs the show inside the cell. I used to ask my students a question: if you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know right away. They're under 40, the information, code, software. Well, the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form, you've got to have instructions inside the cell to build the proteins and the protein parts you need for those new parts of new forms of life. Same thing is true if you want to build life in the first place. You've got to have information in the DNA molecule. And so that's the fundamental question that I addressed in the book. And I argued that that intelligent design, in fact, provides a solution to that mystery.
When you think about all that information that's there and impacted in the least of these elements, I can't help but go back to Aristotle and think the same thing. Aristotle's theory of the entelechy. I don't know if you ever counted that.
The purpose for which something is made.
Yeah, so that's why an acorn becomes an oak tree and not an elephant.
Right.
That it's already inside. There's an entelechy, an intelligence within that encoded to make sure that acorn doesn't become a kangaroo or
and what he would have given to know about the molecular biological revolution.
Exactly.
Because there's the Greeks were fascinated with form and the origin of form.
Right.
And we now know that at the root of the origin of form is information. And this was the key discovery in the 1950s. We all know about the discovery of Watson and Crick and the famous double helix structure of DNA. But 4 or 5 years later, Crick put forward a brilliant hypothesis. It was called the sequence hypothesis. And it was subsequently confirmed. And Crick had the insight to realize that along the spine of the DNA molecule there are 4 chemicals, and that these 4 chemicals are functioning just like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. Which is to say, it's not the chemical or physical properties of those chemicals, they're called the bases, but rather it's their sequential arrangement that gives them their function. Just like Scrabble letters. It's not the little plastic in the letter that is important. It's if you get the letters arranged right to spell a word and land on that triple word score. It's the sequential arrangement that's key to function. And this was, I think, the most important insight of modern biology. And then it was subsequently confirmed, and it sparked the whole molecular biological revolution, which was essentially the realization that information is running the show inside life. We're having an information revolution in our high-tech world, but it's almost uncanny that at about the same time we're inventing this high-tech information technology, we've also discovered it inside life, even in the very simplest cells, and information, therefore, is really the key.
Is anybody in these days brutish enough to deny the obvious presence of design?
Well, of course there are folks, and I'm encountering them all the time on the internet and in various reviews, but I think the tide in this debate is beginning to shift, because most people, and I mean high-tech people, scientists, recognize the connection between information and intelligence.
Right.
I was standing on the soccer sidelines.
But I wasn't asking about intelligent design. Just
design.
But I wasn't asking about intelligent design. Just
design. Oh, yeah. Well, even the Darwinists acknowledge design, but they want to say it's apparent. Yeah. They want to say, Richard Dawkins says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose.
Yes.
Where the key word is appearance.
Right.
And that's, by the way, the origin of the term intelligent design. When we were beginning to realize that there was compelling evidence of intelligent causation, was the way some of the early ID pioneers put it, we were casting about for a name for our theory. And we wanted to contrast it clearly with the central proposition of the Darwinian synthesis, which is that things look designed, but they're not really designed because there's a purely undirected process that's sufficient to produce the appearance of design, the illusion of design. And so we thought the way to make clear what we were arguing against and also what we were for was to contrast the idea of intelligent design with merely apparent design, which is the key, the Darwinian view. And so Richard Dawkins acknowledges, for example, that the machine code of the genes, as he puts it, is uncannily computer-like. It looks like something that was designed by a software programmer, but he wants to hold out for an explanation that will account for that appearance apart from an actual mind or intelligence having played a role.
Sort of an unintelligent intelligence.
Yes, exactly. It's the idea is that you have a purely undirected process producing the appearance of design, and the undirected process is not guided or directed in any way.
And as soon as we say design, to talk about intelligent design is almost, if not altogether, a redundancy. But
you would think, but this is the counterintuitive nature of the Darwinian proposal.
Exactly. But going back to Kant and his critique of pure reason and his critique of the traditional arguments for God, and he dismissed the cosmological and the ontological and all of that. The one thing he said that really burdened him was the teleological argument, the argument from design. Even then, he talked about the starry skies above and the moral law within, that those were the two things he really couldn't get a handle on. And David Hume, who's considered the father of all this skepticism, had the same sense of burden and reacted against those people who wanted to substitute chance as this power, when, of course, chance has no power because it has no ontology.